Okay, guys, welcome again. Here's another quick student game analysis. I just want to go over some of the finer points for Jake and try to highlight some things that we need to stay focused on. So we're going to start off by, the ABCs of chess. Activate your pieces, be safe with your king, and centralize your pieces. I'm not going to go into hyper detail here, but my students understand that these four center squares are very important to their development. So right away, Jake jumps in the center and is influencing and controlling those squares. He does the same thing. Nice natural development, getting ready to get the king safe as quickly as possible. Black decides to play what is called the four knights and counter attacks in the center instead of defending the pawn that's under attack, which normally generates like an Italian game or a Rai Lopez when black plays knight c6. Here, I was explaining that I would have really liked to have seen bishop c4 played. Bishop c4 allows for the rapid castling of the king, and let's just take a look at it. One of the concerns in the position would be knight takes pawn, castle, and then black has to do something. Pawn push, retreat the knight, maybe protect his pawn some kind of way, d6, develop the bishop. He's got a lot of moves that he can make, but the point is when this rook lands on the e-file, there's going to be natural tension against anything that's over there. So even if he decides to protect the pawn, say by doing something like d6, we can just charge in the middle of the board. Bishop e7, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, queen takes queen if we want, bishop takes, rook over attacking the knight and indirectly attacking the pawn, it doesn't matter. If he decides to try to protect the pawn, we just take the other pawn, he's not castling. These kind of moves are all bad for black. This is why getting the king safe first is more important. This is just an example of how the game could have gone. Please feel free to stop the video and review some of these moves. All right, so we're going to go back to the actual position. He played knight c3 instead, defending the pawn instead of getting his king safe. Black has done the same, so we have a symmetrical position. In symmetrical positions, the person who is copying is the one who tends to be at a disadvantage. So the way that you stop a copycat is to put the guy in check. So bishop c4, because both players can't be in check, right? So bishop c4 is getting him closer to getting his king safe. Black takes the prophylactic move, h6. I really dislike this move, guys. Avoid pushing pawns in front of your king unless it absolutely stops checkmate. I tell people all the time, try not to do this. h6 is not a losing move. Let me repeat, h6 is not a losing move. But if you are 1200 and you want to get to 1600, don't make this move. Don't make this move. There's other moves that you can make. I'm not going to give the answer for black because I'm trying to help my student who is playing with the white pieces on what to do here. So with that said, white should now castle, and he does. Black now develops his bishop, getting ready to castle himself. And once you get your king safe, guys, the minute that you get your king safe, you should be looking for ways to prevent your opponent from castling or by attacking. Now, in this particular instance, one of the cheeky ways to attack could have been knight takes pawn, especially with this bishop here, but our bishop would be in the way. Let me just show this. Don't do this. Don't do this. Don't do this. Knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, attacking the bishop. If the bishop was not here, then white would be able to fork the pieces and get his pieces back. But because the bishop is on c4, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, it doesn't work. So we have to look for another way to try to attack. Now we considered this move in the game, knight a4 attacking the bishop, and he might just simply retreat and then castling is going to happen. But what was actually played in the game was knight d5, and I kind of like this move because it undoes, the problem of, blocking the pawns and gaining space in the center. So what happens? He plays d6, does not castle. We're always excited when our opponents don't castle, and we do. C3 gets ready to charge in the center. We're going to open up the center while the king is still there. As long as he's not castling, he's going to be in trouble. Here, my student saw this move and had a visible reaction. He was like, oh my goodness, he's pushing this pawn. He's going to trap my bishop. Let's talk about this. First of all, b5 is not trapping the bishop. The bishop has a lot of different places he can go, okay? The bishop is not trapped. There's no danger of the bishop being trapped. Let's just make a wasted move. Let's just rook over, for example, which happens to make another square for the bishop. But let's just look at it. Bishop here, knight takes knight check. Queen takes knight, and bishop here. Guess who's not trapped? This bishop. This move is not dangerous. This pawn plan is not dangerous at all. This is not something that you should be worried about. But anyway, you didn't panic. You continued with your idea with c3 and d4. Capture, capture. We're liquidating the center. He retreats. We talked about this very briefly. The bishop doesn't have any good squares to go to. He's obviously not going to a3. We looked at going to b4. We would just simply capture that. Knight capture. Queen checks. And if he blocks with the knight, then we simply push the pawn on the knight, putting pressure on the pinned piece. If he opts to try to fork us, we ignore this fork by simply playing bishop captures. If pawn captures, we take his rook. If he doesn't play pawn capture, then this knight is under attack by a plethora of pieces. This is advantage white. So he can't do that. Okay, so he put the piece way back in the cubby hole, and we continued with our attack. Now, I noticed in this position, there was a lot of calculation, and my student was able to see several moves deep in here. Let's talk about what actually happened. The moves that he was calculating was pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, check, queen captures, pawn takes, knight takes, and here he was talking out loud and saying he wanted to check the king and realized that he would get forked and that wouldn't work. But once he got to this position in the post-game analysis, it was very easy for him to see that simply capturing the knight was winning because the queen cannot recapture due to the pin on the king. So after the game, he was able to see this very easily, but we want to push him to be able to see as many moves in advance during the game as possible. It turns out that the game didn't even go this direction. The opponent aborted the combination altogether by simply capturing the knight. We continue with bishop captures. He finally castles on move 11. Now, there was a moment here where we were trying to figure out, is there going to be a way to attack the king on the light squares? And I'm arguing that there is no fast way to attack the king on the light squares. The center is under attack right now. So any retreating move, any passive move is going to be met by a liquidation in the center. Even if you gambit your pawns away and say, hey, I'm going to allow him to take all my pawns in the center, there's no plan that's going to allow you to be able to checkmate black with an attack on the light square. So let's just look at a fantasy line. Bishop returns, pawn takes pawn, bishop goes here, getting on the diagonal. The pawn might take another pawn. You put your queen up here. He simply plays g6. He simply plays g6. Bishop takes pawn. He simply moves the rook over. Or he doesn't even have to move the rook over immediately. He might decide to play bishop here and attack your queen. There's a lot of moves in the position. There is no checkmate on the light squares. It's not happening. So you're just giving away material for nothing. All right, so we go back to the actual game. The attack on the light squares didn't actually happen. He just simply captured a knight, weakening black's pawn structure, giving him 3 pawn islands. Black captures, white develops, defending, the central pawn, trying to maintain some kind of pawn in the center. And this move was very tricky. It's a double attack on the pawn. we're already protecting it 3 times, but this pawn push suggests that the rook wants to be able to attack the bishop. So we have to be careful here. And my student checked the king, which I thought was a good move, taking advantage of the attack on the light squares in this direction. There's no way to block the light squares without the threat of losing material. I guess he could have played rook here. And then maybe we just simply play pawn takes now. Maybe, not sure. Not, asking for a friend. Not sure. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Pushing the pawn though is interesting. Rook over. And we're gonna try to keep this pawn down here as long as possible. We might even double our rooks up on the E file. But that didn't happen. He simply moved his king out of the way. And what did we do? We pushed anyway, grabbing that space. He attacked our queen. Now the student wanted to slide his queen over 1 square and just abandon this pawn. This pawn is not to be abandoned. This pawn is very valuable because once a pawn reaches the 6th rank and has no pawns in front of it, it is worth the value of the piece that is smallest in the black camp. In this case, the smallest piece in the black camp is a bishop. So this pawn is now worth 3 points. We want this pawn on the board as long as possible. All right, that's advanced stuff. I'm not gonna go over it too deeply. If you're interested in learning more, make sure you visit my website, chess-coach.net/chess-lessons, or just go to my site, chess-coach.net, and search on chess lessons, click on book a lesson, etc., and you can get more information about that. We continue. Queen e3 protects the pawn, and now he double attacks here, and I was very concerned about this because my student played rook e3, which is an illusionary protection on the square, because he can just simply take this pawn with any piece he wants, because white is not going to recapture that piece with his queen. That would be losing material. Fortunately for him, the player with the black pieces went totally crazy, failing to realize that this pawn was not really protected and attacked in the center again, giving white the opportunity to really defend the pawn with another piece. The game continues. He blockades the pawn, and that's important. Passed pawns do need to be blockaded before you can build up an attack on it. And then when you do decide to attack, you attack from the base. So black has the right idea, but it never got executed. This is a very attractive knight move. Forking is being threatened. He also has this very problematic knight f5 move incoming. And it really works now after seeing that black took the last square away from the rook. This rook can actually go nowhere. So simply playing knight f5 is going to be a big problemo. And now if you can't find knight f5, by the way, which I think you can because you obviously see that there's a huge check in here, the next most attractive thing in the position is bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes, queen check. The king is either moving or blocking. It doesn't matter because we have queen takes pawn incoming, and then there's a huge vacancy of defenders around the king. All right, so let's just look. Rook here, queen takes pawn check. He's either blocking with the rook or moving his king. We really don't care. Let's just say if he blocks with the rook, we obviously put pressure on the pin piece. This is no bueno. The queen cannot go here, the queen cannot go here, the queen cannot go here. The only thing that can happen is the queen goes here, and the rook still cannot move because of the pin. So that will allow us to lift another rook up and either check him here or stop here on one of these 2 squares, and the game is going to end very quickly after that. So that would have been an alternative plan. But let's get back to the actual game. Bishop takes d6 was played, which is a strange move. It has nothing to do with attacking the king, and it also allows, not only is black gaining material, he's creating an escape square for his rook if the knight goes to f5. So that capture, knight f5 comes in. It is attacking a pawn, but the pawn is not that crucial. This guy decided to move his queen and give up the rook, but the threat was rook here, knight takes pawn on the queen moves somewhere, knight check, king has to get out of check, and then say hello to my little friend. That would have been quite the sexy combination. Never got played, more fantasy analysis. So instead, he simply said, I'm going to let you have this rook because this knight is too dangerous. The tricky knight is too dangerous. So we continue. Knight takes, queen captures, and now we need to get this rook involved here. Probably rook b1 or b3 or rook c1 or rook d1. Anything with this rook just makes more sense. But instead, rook e2 got played. Temple on the queen, and the bishop is protected, so the queen's got to get out of the way. He blockades and simultaneously overprotects the pawn. Kind of a strange move in my opinion, but whatever. The rook comes down and attacks the base. He simply captures the pawn and protects. Double attacks on the base again. White chooses to defend. White's defending very well. These pawns are very valuable. The rook slides over. Now we have to be careful. We do not want this pawn to fall. So he retreats, still maintaining defensive posture. He tickles the queen again. White continues to defend and gets out of the way of the rook. The rook slides back over. White starts to get attacking ideas of his own, possibly queen here, and that would have been very dangerous. For example, let me see. Yeah, queen here still holds the pawn, so this is a good move. If he had just simply played queen here, then this pawn would have fallen, and that would have been a little bit problematic. Now here, the king moved over, but let's talk about what happens if the king doesn't move over. What happens if the rook grabs the pawn? This move is going to be very, very bad for black because the queen cannot capture. This guy is going in. Okay, so he can't capture. There's nothing he can do to defend this. He has no pieces that can come to bear of the queen. And if the queen tries to get out of the way, then this pawn push is going to happen anyway. So this is why he couldn't take the pawn, and he needed to get some defenders on this critical square. So the king steps over. The student played b4, tickling the rook. And also preventing the rook from returning to the c file. Okay, so the rook goes to the b file, and I'm wondering right now if rook c1 was not a move. I feel like rook c1 could have been a big move, but if rook takes check and then check, interesting. So what I was calculating is rook here. Rook takes pawn, rook check. Oh, he could step out, and now two pieces are under attack, and these are not the drones we're looking for. So don't do that. So that's why that didn't work. Okay, so I'm glad my student didn't go through this fantasy line. Instead, he just calmly protected the pawn. And now this retreat is problematic, okay? Because the bishop is no longer protecting the c8 square, so moving a rook to the c file is going to be annoying. And he does. The rook retreats. We double the rooks. And now he tries to regain control over the c file. However, rook c7 is a big, big problem. Unfortunately, my student mouse slipped here and played rook c5. And the game continued, capture, capture. And we can't afford to take anything else. So we continue. He's trading. I think the trade is happening. Now, we're talking about this briefly in the post-mortem. Two connected pass pawns can beat a rook. In this instance, the bishops are influencing the queening square, so it's a very delicate proposition. But if we were in a situation, let's say we had two connected pawns on the 6th and there were no bishops to help the rook, or the king could not help the rook, then the rook would not be able to beat these pawns. I'm just going to make some random moves. Let's just pretend that there's no bishop here and there's no rook here. well, this pawn would actually need to be here. So we need to waste a move. Let's just waste a move, and he doesn't take. Let's just say he goes here. So now, if it's white's move, we could push this pawn. If the rook comes over, we push the other pawn. If he takes, then we push the other pawn. Ignoring these other pieces, by the way, and ignoring the fact that there's a rook here. The whole point is, once these guys get here, no matter which pawn that the rook tries to take, the other one is going to queen. They're too close. All right, so we had to create a very, egregious fantasy situation in order to demonstrate that. We'll talk more about that in the lesson. All right, so in this case, we pushed the pawn, and he chose to just get rid of the pawn right away. Now he's going to have to sacrifice his bishop. We push. Only the bishop can get back in time because the rook cannot get back in time, and the rook cannot come over. In this other position where the rook could have come over, it doesn't matter because after rook captures, bishop captures queen. Not only are we putting the king in check, but we're also grabbing more material. All right, so we go back. He could have also played bishop takes pawn right away, but that would allow us to play rook takes bishop, and we're holding our pawn now, and we're going to rapidly try to get reinforcements on that pawn while we go and harass the bishop. So black saw all that, wasn't interested, and decided to just simply take the pawn and give up the dark square bishop, which is how that happened. Now, white is still losing, but he's not losing as bad as he was before. The only chance that he has is to try to trick his opponent, but he does have to watch out for the back rank mating opportunities. So he gets some space, walks out, the guy tries to attack the pawn. We protect the pawn very simply. He temples the rook off of the square. We move the rook to a dark square so that this bishop is no longer important. He grabs some more space. We tickle the bishop, to take squares away from the bishop. The bishop's got to retreat or go play on, maybe a third or 2/3 of the board. He does casually retreat. We tickle the bishop with tempo. Rook defends. We like it when their pieces are in defensive posture. If they're defending, they're not attacking. Okay, so we like this position. We simply go over and attack the pawn. We're trying to sacrifice this pawn for what we call a minority attack, hoping that he will take and separate. Now let's just look at what happens if we capture here. We do this. He was worried about this move check, but we just simply take this guy. Check doesn't work. We come back. Everything's fine. We just separated his pawns. These pawns cannot defend themselves. Isolated pawns cannot defend themselves. So these are weaknesses. And then we also have to worry about this guy over here. So this would have been very bad. Of course, the opponent did not go for it. He just simply ignored it and moved his king forward. So we tempo the bishop. The bishop retreats. We slide over. Bishop retreats again. We attack the pawn. The pawn moves forward. We check, sacrificing the pawn so that we can break the base. We're getting what we call an imbalance, breaking the symmetry in the position. He does capture the pawn, which was a little suspect. He could have simply just retreated, which would have been totally fine. He is up material. We can get this pawn back anytime and get ready. But he takes it, allowing us to grab space. This is a potential pass pawn on this side of the board, which will probably get captured anyway because black does have the extra material. Instead, black goes after the pawn, which can't be defended, right? Because the rook can no longer get over to the A file. He failed to see, however, that this check was going to cause some significant problems. He has to get rid of the bishop right now. Bishop takes, pawn takes, king takes, rook takes pawn, and black should win this game without much complication. However, he didn't do it. He missed the fact that after the king steps up, he has nowhere to go, and this is just simply checkmate. This is just simply checkmate. So kudos to the student. My students are consistently finding ways to try to checkmate their opponent by staying focused and maintaining pressure on the king. It's not a material game. It's a game about attacking the king. This is the coach. Visit my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/chesscoachnet. Also visit my website, chesscoachnet. Check me out on my Instagram, Chess Coach, Twitter, Real Chess Coach. You can find me all on the socials, and definitely check the YouTube out. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.